Jasmine Crockett approached the podium with the same unshaken composure she was known for. The press room, buzzing with conversation, quieted as she began speaking in her steady, deliberate tone. From the very start, it was clear she wasn't there to grandstand or stir the crowd with fiery rhetoric. Instead, she opened by talking about transparency in leadership, stressing the need for elected officials to be accountable for their past associations, their decisions, and the influence of the people they kept close. She explained that her remarks that day weren't based on hearsay or political rumor, but on records documents that had been available for years, yet had rarely been pieced together in a way that the public could clearly understand. Asterisk, she began, carefully laying out the early years of Jeffrey Epstein's influence, moving through a timeline that most reporters had seen in fragments before. Without raising her voice, she drew attention to specific points where Donald Trump's path intersected with Epstein's. She noted how their social circles overlapped in the late 1980s and 1990s, particularly in New York and Palm Beach, where elite parties and private gatherings often blurred the lines between business, networking, and personal relationships. Crockett made no wild accusations, nor did she dwell on sensationalized tabloid stories. Instead, she cited confirmed events, photographs, interviews, and court filings that documented moments when Trump and Epstein were seen in the same spaces, often alongside other high-profile names. Asterisk, she referenced a 2002 New York Magazine interview where Trump himself acknowledged knowing Epstein and described him as a terrific guy at the time, even noting Epstein's fondness for younger women. Crockett paused after quoting those words, letting them settle in the room without further commentary. She didn't need to add emphasis. The quote spoke for itself. Moving on, she detailed how the two men eventually had a public falling out, something Trump had brought up in later years when asked about his connection to Epstein, but she didn't let the narrative stop there. She pointed out that the very nature of such relationships in elite circles often meant that falling out or not, shared history, and overlapping networks couldn't simply be erased. Asterisk, she took care to note that knowing someone like Epstein didn't automatically imply complicity in his crimes. However, Crockett explained, when public figures rise to the highest levels of political power, their past connections, especially those involving individuals later exposed for serious offenses, must be examined with transparency. The public, she argued, has the right to see the full picture, even if the facts are uncomfortable. Her tone throughout remained measured, almost clinical, as if she were walking the audience through an evidence file rather than delivering a political attack. Asterisk, as she spoke, the room's attention never wavered. Reporters who had been casually checking their phones were now typing furiously, their eyes darting between Crockett's printed pages and the expressions of the colleagues beside them. There was no shouting, no dramatic gestures, just a steady, deliberate voice revealing a chain of details that was difficult to ignore. Asterisk. She underscored the point that the issue wasn't about whether Trump had committed the same crimes Epstein had been accused of, but rather about the larger question of judgment, integrity, and the company one chooses to keep, especially for someone who had served as President of the United States. This wasn't about dredging up old gossip. It was about the principle that leaders should be willing to answer for the entirety of their public and private record. Asterisk, by presenting the information in such a restrained, yet thorough manner, Crockett created an environment where the facts themselves carried the weight, rather than the delivery. It was a calculated approach, one that left little room for Trump's allies to dismiss her words as baseless political mudslinging. Instead, they were forced to contend with the substance of her remarks, each detail grounded in verifiable sources. This, Crockett seemed to understand, was far more potent than any loud accusation could ever be. When Jasmine Crockett stepped up to the podium, she did not begin with fiery accusations or emotionally charged soundbites. Instead, she opted for a slower, more deliberate approach, one that relied entirely on verifiable information. This is what made her delivery stand out. She had no need for dramatic pauses or raised tones, because her confidence rested in the documents she had in front of her. She understood that, in an environment where political discourse is often filled with noise, clarity could be far more disruptive than volume. And in this moment, her clarity was intentional. Asterisk, she started by holding up a thin, neatly organized folder. Inside were pages that had been pulled from public court filings, magazine archives, and photographs that had long been accessible but rarely discussed together in one place. Without embellishment, she flipped to a page and read from it directly, the words unshaken in her voice. It was a quote from a 2002 interview in New York Magazine, in which Donald Trump described Jeffrey Epstein as a terrific guy and mentioned that Epstein liked women on the younger side. Crockett didn't glance up for effect. She simply let the words stand, allowing the room to register them for what they were, a statement given by Trump himself. On the record, years before Epstein's crimes became public knowledge, asterisk, she moved next to a series of events from the late 1980s through the early 2000s, walking through a timeline where Trump and Epstein's paths crossed. She noted how both men operated within the same exclusive circles in New York and Palm Beach. They were photographed together at social gatherings, charity events, and private parties. Crockett pointed out that, While it was common for people in elite social networks to be seen together, what mattered was the pattern, the repeated interactions over years, the public acknowledgement of familiarity, and the later attempt to minimize that connection once Epstein's legal troubles became headline news. She explained that these facts were not sourced from anonymous insiders or partisan leaks, but from publicly available material, archived news stories, video footage, and sworn testimony. She emphasized that her role wasn't to make assumptions about what Trump knew or didn't know about Epstein's activities at the time, but to outline the depth of their association as recorded in documented history. By sticking only to what could be confirmed, Crockett removed the easy out for critics to dismiss her as peddling conspiracy theories. At one point, she referenced a party at Mar-a-Lago in 1992, where Trump and Epstein were filmed laughing and conversing casually. She didn't suggest anything beyond what the footage showed, but she described the context. The gathering was small, the interactions seemed familiar, and the setting was Trump's own property. For viewers, these details quietly reinforced the reality that Trump and Epstein weren't mere acquaintances who happened to cross paths once or twice. They were men who moved in the same spaces with ease. Crockett also took time to point out how Trump himself had publicly acknowledged knowing Epstein for many years before later claiming they had a falling out. She read Trump's own words from interviews in which he spoke about distancing himself from Epstein after a dispute. Again, she didn't speculate on what caused the rift or what it meant. Instead, she used it to illustrate how the nature of their relationship shifted in public statements over time. It was this factual layering, quotes, timelines, photographic evidence that made her delivery so effective. There was no attempt to spark outrage by dramatizing events. Crockett's focus was on making sure that every person listening could follow the sequence of facts without needing to trust her interpretation. She knew that the power of this moment came from her ability to present information in such a straightforward way that it could not be brushed aside as partisan theater. And by mentioning Trump directly, citing his own words and documented appearances, she ensured that the information was anchored to sources he himself could not easily dispute. In doing so, Crockett's methodical presentation became its own form of pressure. Each sentence was like placing another brick in a wall of evidence, not constructed through speculation, but through the very record Trump had helped create over the years. It was a reminder that sometimes, the most impactful way to confront a powerful figure is not through loud condemnation, but by calmly laying their own history in front of the public for them to see. The speed of Donald Trump's response to Jasmine Crockett's remarks was striking, even for someone known to react quickly when his image was at stake. In the fast-paced world of political news, it's not unusual for a public figure's team to take a few hours, sometimes even days, to craft an official statement, weighing the tone, the wording, and the implications. But in this case, within barely an hour of Crockett's press conference ending, Trump's camp had issued a detailed rebuttal. That urgency alone suggested that her calm but precise delivery had struck closer to home than they were willing to admit. When Crockett finished speaking, the footage of her remarks began circulating almost immediately. Reporters posted clips to social media, news outlets started drafting headlines, and conversations were already taking place in television studios about what she had revealed. It wasn't that she had unearthed completely new evidence. Much of what she presented had existed in the public domain for years. What made it different was the way she had threaded the facts together, linking quotes, photographs, and timelines into a cohesive narrative that was difficult to dismiss. For Trump's team, this was not the kind of story that could be ignored and hoped away. Silence, in such moments, risks letting a narrative solidify in the public's mind. And Crockett's version of events had a dangerous quality for any political figure. It was fact-driven, non-theatrical, and delivered without malice. It's far easier to deflect an emotional, partisan attack than a calm recitation of documented history. The calculated speed of their response signaled an awareness that her remarks could gain traction in spaces beyond the usual political battlegrounds. The statement from Trump's spokesperson was direct but defensive. It framed Crockett's press conference as nothing more than a political stunt and insisted that any suggestion of wrongdoing was baseless and desperate. Yet the length and detail of the statement, combined with how quickly it appeared, drew attention in itself. Observers noted that this wasn't the usual short dismissal that Trump's team sometimes issued in response to critics. Instead, it read like something prepared in haste, but meant to sound definitive, almost as if they feared the story might grow legs if left unchecked. Privately, according to sources familiar with the campaign's media operations, there was concern about how Crockett's remarks were already being interpreted online. Trump's past association with Jeffrey Epstein was not new territory, but every time the topic resurfaced, it risked reopening old questions that Trump preferred to address only on his own terms. Crockett's decision to quote Trump directly from past interviews, and to cite events that had been documented in photographs and video, left little room for his team to claim her remarks were fabricated. That meant their response had to focus on dismissing her motives rather than dismantling the factual content. Inside political circles, the speed of the reaction was seen as telling. Communications teams generally monitor breaking news and decide whether it warrants an immediate counter or a delayed, more calculated approach. The calculus usually comes down to whether responding early will quash a story or amplify it. In this case, the Trump camp clearly judged that waiting would allow Crockett's framing to dominate coverage for too long. Their decision to jump in so quickly underscored the fact that they recognized the potential damage if her words were allowed to stand unchallenged for even a news cycle. Crockett's team, for their part, seemed prepared for the backlash. In follow-up interviews, she reiterated that she had relied entirely on publicly available information and that her role was to remind the public of the importance of accountability, especially for those who have occupied the highest office in the land. The more she repeated that point, the more it reinforced the notion that her remarks were not an act of political theater, but a straightforward presentation of facts, and that framing made Trump's rapid and emphatic response appear even more reactionary. For Trump personally, the speed of the statement reflected his broader media strategy, one built on never allowing an opponent to control the narrative. Over the years, he had developed a reputation for meeting criticism head-on, often within hours or even minutes of its surfacing. This time, however, the nature of Crockett's remarks complicated the usual tactics. He couldn't simply dismiss her as making wild accusations because she hadn't made any. She had, instead, drawn from his own words and well-documented events. That reality likely drove the urgency to issue a counter-narrative before the media cycle turned her calm presentation into the dominant version of the story. The swiftness of the response was not just about damage control. It was about signaling to his base that he was not caught off guard. In political perception, speed can be a form of strength, a way of telling supporters that their leader is fully in control of the situation. But to neutral observers, it was hard to miss the undercurrent of concern in how quickly the statement came together. In politics, the tempo of a response often says as much as its content, and in this case, the tempo told a story all its own. When the clip of Jasmine Crockett's press conference began circulating online, it wasn't the kind of political exchange that usually dominates social media. There was no shouting match, no interruptions, and no overly dramatic exchanges that could be turned into a meme. Instead, the video showed her speaking steadily, flipping through her folder of documents, and reading directly from sources. Yet within hours, that measured delivery had spread across multiple platforms, racking up millions of views. What made it stand out was not just the subject matter, Trump's past association with Jeffrey Epstein, but the way Crockett had packaged it. She wasn't trying to perform for the cameras. She was simply presenting information in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. The simplicity of her approach gave the clip a certain shareable quality. Viewers didn't need to agree with her politically to follow what she was saying. She quoted Trump directly, displayed photographs that anyone could find in public archives, and laid out a timeline that didn't require political background knowledge to understand. That accessibility made it appealing to audiences far beyond the usual political followers. People who rarely engaged in political debates were now posting the video with captions like, "This is how you do it," or "Facts only." The contrast between Crockett's quiet composure and the gravity of the topic made the video even more powerful. Social media thrives on content that feels authentic, and her delivery came across as exactly that. She wasn't trying to score quick applause lines or bait her opponent into a reaction, though Trump's team did in fact respond quickly. Instead, she let the facts do the work. In doing so, she made it harder for critics to dismiss her as simply attacking Trump for political gain. The more people watched, the more it became clear that the force of her remarks came from the record itself, not from any attempt at dramatization. Trump's name was mentioned repeatedly in the clip, but always in the context of verifiable moments. She referred to his quotes from a 2002 interview, where he spoke positively about Epstein and pointed out their documented appearances together over the years. The fact that she didn't speculate about the meaning of those interactions made her mentions of him carry more weight. It was as if she was saying to viewers, "I'm not telling you what to think, I'm just showing you what happened." That framing allowed the audience to draw their own conclusions, which often has a more lasting impact than being told directly what to believe. As the clip spread, commentators began noting how rare it was for a political moment to go viral without leaning on heated rhetoric. Normally viral political videos rely on confrontation, someone delivering a biting insult, a heated exchange, or a passionate speech that rallies one side while infuriating the other. Crockett's approach broke that mold. She didn't try to embarrass Trump with personal jabs or exaggerated claims. She simply presented his own words and actions in a sequence that, on its own, was enough to raise questions. That lack of theatrics may have been precisely why the video resonated so widely. People across the political spectrum could watch it, without feeling like they were being pulled into a shouting match. Even some who typically supported Trump admitted the clip was worth watching, if only to see what she had actually said. In a digital environment where misinformation spreads quickly, a calm, fact-based presentation stood out as something people felt comfortable sharing without worrying about it being debunked later. Asterisk, the more the clip circulated, the more it began showing up in unexpected places. It wasn't just political accounts posting it. Lifestyle influencers, business professionals, and even entertainment figures shared it with comments about the value of composure when addressing serious topics. For Trump's team, that presented a different kind of challenge. It meant the conversation wasn't staying confined to political corners where they could easily counter it with their own messaging. Instead, it was leaking into broader online culture, where their statements might not reach the same audience as effectively. Asterisk. What made the viral spread even more notable was that the clip's appeal wasn't tied to any clever editing or visuals. It was just the raw footage of Crockett speaking, uncut and uninterrupted. That gave it a sense of credibility. Viewers could see the entire exchange, not just a snippet taken out of context. And because her remarks about Trump were rooted in well-documented history, every rewatch reinforced the idea that this was not an emotional outburst, but a carefully prepared account. Asterisk for Trump. The challenge in facing a moment like this was that responding too aggressively risked making the clip even bigger, while ignoring it entirely could allow it to dominate online discussions for days. The fact that his team chose to respond quickly showed they recognized the danger of letting it spread unchecked. But by then, the momentum had already started. In the modern news cycle, a video that captures the public's attention in the first few hours can shape the conversation long after official statements are issued. In this case, Crockett's.com delivery and her deliberate, fact-based mentions of Trump ensured that the clip kept circulating not because it was sensational, but because it felt undeniable. In the end, the impact of Jasmine Crockett's remarks was defined not just by what she said, but by how she said it. In a political landscape where confrontation often overshadows content, she proved that facts, when presented with precision and composure, can be just as disruptive as the loudest outburst. Her decision to keep the focus entirely on verifiable events, documented quotes, and public records left little space for opponents to claim she was manufacturing a narrative. By grounding every point in established evidence, she placed the burden of explanation squarely on Donald Trump, without ever needing to raise her voice. Asterisk, the rapid response from Trump's team, while framed as a dismissal, inadvertently underscored the seriousness with which they took her remarks. Political communication is strategic by nature, and the choice to issue a detailed rebuttal within such a short window suggested they understood the potential reach of her words. In politics, speed is often a tell. It signals either confidence in controlling the story or urgency in containing it, and in this case, many observers read the speed as the latter. The more the clip spread, the more it became clear that Crockett's delivery had struck a nerve. Asterisk, what was perhaps most remarkable was the way her calm presentation translated into virality. Social media, for all its chaos and noise, is not always driven by outrage alone. There is a hunger for content that feels measured, credible, and free of overblown theatrics. Crockett's appearance tapped into that hunger. Viewers could share the clip without worrying it would be fact-checked into irrelevance. Even those who disagreed with her politically could watch without feeling they were being shouted at or manipulated. In that sense, her performance functioned as a case study in how to communicate difficult truths in a polarized climate. Asterisk for Trump. The episode was a reminder that not all challenges come in the form of loud political attacks. Sometimes the most difficult moments to counter are those that are understated but well prepared. When an opponent chooses to let the record speak for itself, it limits the avenues for rebuttal. His own words from decades past, his documented appearances, and his public acknowledgments of certain relationships all were presented without judgment, but in a sequence that invited viewers to draw their own conclusions. That framing is harder to dismantle because it doesn't depend on persuasion. It depends on memory and evidence. Asterisk, as the news cycle moved forward, the clip continued to resurface, often in conversations about the power of tone and presentation. It stood as an example that political influence isn't always about dominating the room. Sometimes it's about controlling the pace, the facts, and the framing. For Crockett, the day's events cemented her reputation as a communicator who can deliver a message without letting emotion cloud her precision. For Trump, it became another chapter in the ongoing reality that past associations and public statements do not fade simply because time has passed. In the space between those two realities, the public was left to decide what the facts meant, and that, perhaps,